This is the Mixed Martial Arts Beat for the 4th week of February 2014. Hello again, everyone. I'm Ariel Helwani inside our New York City studio. We've been off for the last 2 weeks, but it seems like a litany of MMA news has broken. We have a lot to get to this week, so let us get right into it. Of course, you know him. He is Luke Thomas of MMA Fighting.com and the SiriusXM Fight Club. That is Jeff Wagenheim of SportsIllustrated.com. And over there, the man with the hat, Chuck Mindenhall of MMA Fighting.com. So guys, we've been a little lazy over the last couple of weeks and we missed a boatload of news. So much has happened, and we'll start this time around with Nate Diaz. Once again, he goes to Twitter, and this time he's not talking about proms or reunions or money. He says he wants to be released. He says he's done with the UFC. He asked for his release. Now, what do you make of this? And also, when you talk about this, Luke, it's very interesting to listen to the fans' reaction as well, because typically they have supported the Diaz brothers. I don't know if you saw this. It seemed like a lot of them are getting a little tired of his antics. What do you think?
Yeah, that's which is a spillover from Nick. I don't follow Nate Diaz on Twitter. I don't know if he orders pizzas that way or schedules dentist appointments on Twitter, but he loves Twitter, man. It's amazing. You know what? It makes everything instantly public. Which is, I think, is whatever you make of their ability to push a plan forward. I don't think that was accidental. I definitely feel like they want to make these things public because that's actually part of their leveraging power. There was some discontent about Nick Diaz, right, because of the whole marijuana thing and then the suing, and it didn't go his way, and then he finally got the St. Pierre fight, and it wasn't really all that great. With Nathan Diaz, I certainly feel like, I don't think Gilbert Melendez is in his ear necessarily, pushing him to do this, but I think everyone is kind of seeing what happened there and realizing that if you push back, if you stamp your feet, if you make some noise, it can work for you in all kinds of ways. In terms of fan reaction, I haven't paid a whole lot of attention to it, but I definitely feel like I got some people on Twitter telling me like, "Whoa, I thought you and Gil were going to clean out the divisions together," and blah blah blah. I don't know what it will. I don't think anything will happen in the end, except that he airs this out. But certainly, it appears to be anyway related to what happened with Gilbert Melendez.
But there's a big difference there, right? Gilbert Melendez was a free agent. Nathan Diaz is not a free agent.
For a guy who is so good at grappling, it's amazing how this guy does not have a grasp of the concept of leverage. Because Gil didn't have a contract anymore. He could go and sign somewhere else, and sure there was a matching right, and that's all that stuff played out. But Nate is under contract, and he still has fights to go. Plus, he's gotten mauled in 2 of his last 3 fights. So the way that he's going to get out of here is by making himself someone that the UFC doesn't want to do business with. I mean, if they want to do business with him, they're going to keep doing business with him. And the way he gets out of that is by going on one of his homophobic rants or something, one of those things that he's done. But then does Bellator or somebody else really want to be doing business with a guy who's going on homophobic rants?
Well, yeah, they signed War Machine.
Good point. So I don't know.
Well, I mean, it's interesting with the Diaz brothers. My first reaction is not to have a reaction at all, honestly, because they, like you mentioned on Twitter, they say things, the logic from the Diaz brothers is a little bit different than other people's logic. There is a little bit, though, maybe of an elder statesman thing going on with the guy. Even though he's 28 years old, Nate Diaz has been around for a long time. He won Tough 5. He's had like 11 different end-of-the-night bonuses. He's had title shots, headlined 6 cards. He's a guy who's been around. They've been able to use him. It might just be discontent with his existing contract. He sees Gilbert suddenly getting something more. Maybe he just sees it that way. But it is strange timing, especially given the fact that, he looked good in his last fight against Gray Maynard, but before then, including a title shot, he didn't look as good as he did. So it's probably, if anything that's strange about it, it's the timing of that whole thing.
I think the Diaz brothers are heavily influenced by the way in which the boxing model works, where you can be a loser and get a title shot. You can be a loser and get a huge fight. Canelo and Angulo are both coming off of losses, and Arislandi Lara is out there being like, why do these 2 idiots get to fight each other? And so I think they feel like if we're valuable, it shouldn't really matter necessarily if my last 5 fights are all first-round stoppages. Second thing I'd say is you're right about the Diaz logic. If you talk to them, they'll often pick out weird things that you didn't consider. I wonder if they saw the Pat Barry situation. Very, very different, completely different, really. But he asked for a release and he got one. I wonder if they saw that and felt like, well, maybe we could try,
And you mentioned the boxing model, but this is not unprecedented in the UFC. We've seen guys who have come off losses and been elevated. So this can happen, but I just don't think that Nate Diaz is in position to make it happen right now.
And we often don't see guys who are stars asking for releases. I mean, really, correct me if I'm wrong, last time this happened, this kind of fighter, and he isn't at the level of Randy Couture, but it is Randy Couture-esque. I mean, can you think of someone since Randy that has asked for his release, you know, on a big stage and who is a draw? Because let's be honest, Nate Diaz is a draw. The Diaz brothers are still draws. Absolutely. And that's one thing they have in their back pocket. That show in Las Vegas that he headlined against Gray Maynard was a very weak card, but it did very well. I mean, the ratings did very well, over 1 million viewers on Fox Sports 1 at a time when the viewership wasn't as high. So he certainly is a draw, but since then, you know, he complained about not wanting to fight on that date. He complained about the money he was being offered to fight Khabib Nurmagomedov. He complains now. At some point, does the UFC just have to cut their losses, or is he too important to them to, you know, just give away to Bellator or someone like that?
I don't think they'd ever give him away. I mean, for free, something like, which is what they would basically be doing.
Someone wants to be released. Do you just release him?
At some point, I think they could, right? I mean, if it got...
They could do whatever they want.
Sure. I mean, if it got so poisonous where he was, you know, not even trying in fights and losing badly to people he could easily beat, or something like that, right? I mean, maybe then they might do it, or he, you know, God forbid, broke some law or something like that. But short of that, I mean, they're not. I mean, this is a year where they desperately need headliners, and as much as they may have some issues with Nate Diaz, and clearly vice versa, they're still probably going to be in a position to want to keep him. In fact, even if they don't release him, maybe the belly aching will result in that he will get a prominent place on a prominent card, and maybe he will.
That happens more often than not, right?
Right, and so we've always talked about it. Tim Kennedy getting the fight. If the squeaky wheel gets the grease, maybe he won't get what he wants, but he'll get something closer to it.
Good
but
point.
That tweet did disappear, if I'm not mistaken. I think he took it off of Twitter. So
it's out there.
It's out there, but if
and the sentiment is out there, right? It's clear that he's unhappy.
Sure.
I mean, he tagged Dana and the UFC, right?
Yeah.
With a question mark.
Them's fighting words. But you guys bring up a good point. There's no doubt that there's a connection to Gilbert Melendez. I mean, they're very good friends, and Gilbert, in the end, got what he wanted. It's very interesting because Dana White said, you know, being George St. Pierre's best friend doesn't make you a good manager. From where I sit, I mean, Gilbert Melendez hit a home run, right? And you wrote an article about this. You would agree that, and it's not only him. This worked out perfectly for Gilbert.
Agreed.
UFC and Bellator, but as far as like fighters sticking up for themselves and getting what they want, he hit a home run.
He did hit a home run, and it was one of those situations too. If even talking to Dana about it after the fact, he's like, you know, he wanted to go out there and test the waters in free agency a little bit. He wasn't just dipping his toe in; he actually signed a contract, and they had to match that. I mean, that's testing the waters is just kind of maybe talking to Bellator a little bit and seeing what they might do. But he actually had signed that contract. Ultimately, I thought it worked out for everybody, but it was most particularly for Gilbert Melendez. Not only does he get the contract he wants, dictated by Bellator and to his happiness and everything else, he gets a title shot. He gets to coach on Tough. It's every possible thing, all the exposure, all the money, all the things he wanted, all in one thing. So yeah, it's a home run for him.
And it's also going to be interesting to see where the line is between the fighters who can go out and do this and the fighters who can go out and do this and then the UFC says bye-bye. And so there's going to be a line, and it's going to be, you know, top 5 guys, it's going to be top 10 guys.
This is one of those things where the UFC rankings, which people criticize a lot, actually probably plays a good role for a fighter because he's ranked up there. I don't know where it is, like right in that top.
2.
Yeah, so number 2. This is the UFC's rankings. So for a guy to go and sign somewhere else, it's out there that they've got him ranked number 2, and you're about to lose your number 2 guy, which you can't afford to do ultimately.
But are you surprised they re-signed him? Are you surprised because part of them could have been like, this was a guy who was out there saying, I can't wait to fight Mike Chandler and Eddie Alvarez. So maybe I was thinking they might re-sign him, or they might just say, you know, screw off.
Just
go over
the
there.
indication from Dana White though wasn't to just blow him up. After initially sort of, I'm done dealing with Gilbert Melendez, not doing it. As soon as he signed that, it was sort of like he's out there testing. It was a lot more. Yeah, it was very calm. So my feeling was that they were going to match it. They were not trying to make a big deal of that.
I'm not sure how much we'll see this scenario. I think it made sense for Bellator. In fact, WWE expressed surprise that they came to him. Remember that? They weren't even thinking about it, and then Gilbert Melendez made it possible. And now I think that's jogging this, or not the memory per se, but it's making revenue more aware that they can be players here. But you know, they have a lightweight division that's pretty strong. Adding Gilbert Melendez makes sense. They can strategically add him. He's not a pay-per-view draw, but a guy who headlines cards. So it worked out for them. The thing that has always helped the UFC, though, is that guys have always said, well, you know, the best money's in the UFC, typically, but you know, you want to fight the best guys in the world. I want to be the best, and I got to do that here. And certainly Gilbert Melendez expressed that after the fact when he re-signed with the UFC. But I think what you might find is that some guys are saying, you know what, maybe I'll just take the money. maybe that there is an organization out there, and I can't be number one in the world there. I mean, I can be number one in that organization, but they can pay me a very, very competitive wage, and they can do things for me on Spike TV or whatever else they can, do in the Viacom portfolio. And that is now a wrinkle that I don't think you saw before. The UFC always kind of had guys being like, well, if we're going to fight the best, I got to be here. I think what you might start seeing is some guys saying, I'd rather just get paid.
And we're talking about the dramatic backstory of this all, but there's also just the nuts and bolts of doing business. And Bellator wasn't going to give an offer to Gil Melendez that was not in line with what they could afford to pay. They saw him as something that they wanted in their company, and they offered him commensurate money. Same with UFC. If the Bellator had given him, Anderson Silva money, then I don't think the UFC would have matched the deal. So there is just this sort of dry, sort of cold-hearted business aspect of all this, so that is underlying the soap opera drama of Bjorn and Dana trying to butt heads and who's going to get this guy and the tug of war and all that. There is this kind of numbers on a spreadsheet kind of thing that's going on as well.
What I found to be most interesting was that after a stretch of negative press from the Eddie Alvarez stuff to this Curran and the whole featherweight title situation with Strauss and Pitbull being upset. This was, a situation where Bellator lost out. They didn't gain anything. They don't have a fighter coming to them, but they just looked really good. And I think fighters will now start to think, hey, wait a second, this is a place that I could go. And that's why I feel like for Bellator, wow, they really played this perfect. They were the ones that broke the news. I mean, they were sitting back and broke the news with a press release. This was probably the most positive piece of news that came out for Bellator in the last 6 or so months. Wouldn't you agree?
Far and away. I can't think of anything else. Not the Rampage fight where he won, and not anything. Certainly they got some goodwill for the Alvarez-Chandler rematch. I think people felt really good about that. And Eddie winning, of course.
But man, all those fighters that texted me saying, is this really going to happen? You could see a light just switched off. A lot of guys were starting to think, wait a second, something's going on here.
If they can position themselves as the reasonable alternative to Dana White going on Fox Sports 1 and saying, I'm done dealing with Gilbert Melendez manager, who, by the way, might have pulled off one of the greatest managerial moves of the last year in all of contract negotiations. If he can, all he has to do is be more reasonable than that, offer a competitive wage, and all of a sudden Bellator, Dana White says they can't get out of those contracts, and maybe he's right. Maybe they don't want to. Maybe they get paid over there for some guys. Obviously, some guys don't get paid squat, but you get the idea.
Right.
And it was also key that Gil Melendez signed an offer. I mean, it was like when you mentioned how Dana White was saying, well, he's just out there testing the waters, but he actually did more than that. He actually signed an offer. That tells fighters something. That Gil was not just going out there and see, well, what can I get from Bellator? Now I'll take it back there and get more money from the UFC. He was actually willing to fight in that organization. He's a top guy. So there's not any, I don't know whether fighters think of there being a stigma as a Bellator being like the clear number 2 or how much these guys think about that, but clearly one of the top lightweights in the world said, I'll go fight for those guys. And really did it. Put his, signed the contract or signed the offer sheet. That's a significant thing.
Bellator smart play in the end to basically have statements ready to say that it's all about the fairness of the fighters. I mean, to me, that was like where they hit their home run, was just saying like, hey, we're just trying to make it fair for the guys and so that they get paid what they're worth. You know what I mean? And it worked out for this Gilbert Melendez thing. Will it work out for other guys? Like I said, Gilbert Melendez, everybody knew, was a very top guy. It would have to be a guy in that equivalent position to make those sort of demands and have the UFC sort of quietly meet them like that.
And this is why I think the Nate Diaz tweet is directly related to the Gilbert Melendez. I mean, they're friends, and he saw that, all right, Gilbert went out, he was tweeting about stuff with Bellator. The big difference, of course, is that Nate Diaz is not a free agent right now. Now, the only negative thing to come out of this Gilbert Melendez deal, in my opinion, I don't want to use the word negative, but the one kind of part that I'm not all that jazzed up about is the fact that he's going on tough with Anthony Pettis. Now, on paper, I have no problem with that, but the big issue I have with it is that we're going to see this fight, what are we, February right now? In 10 months. We're going to have to wait 10 more months to see both those guys fight. Now, we know that Anthony Pettis is injured, but he said he was going to be ready to come back around the summertime. Shouldn't we be done with putting these guys on the shelf for that long just for tough? Shouldn't we use guys like, we were talking about this earlier. You have Matt Hughes and Matt Serra. They're two old timers. They're squawking at each other on Twitter. Yeah, they won't fight, but you can use those guys as coaches. Why put a champion and a top contender on the shelf for 10 months just for tough?
Yeah, especially in a year like this where they need these guys. I don't know what the answer is. If you think of it in those terms, it doesn't make sense.
Does it bother you?
No, I don't watch Ultimate Fighter.
Exactly. Doesn't that bother you?
No.
You won't get to watch it. So
I wouldn't watch it anyway.
So as a result, they're gone. You won't have to think about
yes,
them.
in that sense, in their absence from actual live events. Yeah, that sucks. My only guess is that this is part of the matching. Right? Like, if you think about it on paper, like, these two guys, I mean, yes, that fight is great, you know, Melendez versus Pettis, okay, that's cool. But why put them on Ultimate Fighter? They wouldn't be the obvious choice given all the other alternatives out there. My sense is that it has to be part of what that was their way of matching whatever television component was in the Viacom deal that was offered to Melendez. That was how they met that requirement. Other than that, I can't imagine why they would do that.
It seems like they're very excited about it. Both Pettis and Melendez seem very excited about it. It just seems like for the fans, and you mentioned a great point, so many events, so many injuries, you need those guys as soon as possible.
Yeah, and I'll look at it from all sides of it. I watched the Ultimate Fighter, the fights part of it, and I would be interested in seeing top coaches. You know, when the Fight Master, I might have been one of the few people that watched that Bellator Fight Master show, and I liked watching Greg Jackson coaching guys. I liked watching actual coaches coaching guys. Not so much watching, you know, this fighter and this fighter who are going to meet at the end coaching. I'm not as interested in that. I want to see coaches coach. So seeing, you know, Sarah, who's now a coach, get him out there. You know, I don't know. You know, Matt Hughes is not in that role, but he's a veteran who could offer something. I would rather see guys who are in that role take that role to this reality show. But I don't think the UFC is that interested in that show as a developmental show. They're not. I don't think they're caring about, well, we're going to get a whole new bunch of, in this case, you know, strawweight women. I mean, this is a little different anyway. But I think they're more interested in using it as a promotional tool. And I know that they have other promotional tools available to them that they could use quicker. But I think they see this as, in their minds, this is how they build the excitement for a fight.
I think that the problem I have with it is the same thing you were talking about. You put these guys on shelf. Not only does it take those guys, not only does it take Melendez out of it and possibly, you know, put off Pettis' return, but it holds up everything in that division. This is a division that has sort of been hijacked for a long time with all the Edgar series with Maynard, et cetera. It's just, it takes, so guys like TJ Grant, for instance, who were right there and we're still waiting for him to recover from his concussion symptoms, but he's no longer going to be in that discussion. He's now probably 2 fights away again from ever getting back to where he was. Jose Aldo, the thing that we were talking about a couple weeks ago, suddenly that's just gone. That's not a real possibility in this year, the 2014. And all the guys, you know, Nurmagomedov, guys like that, anybody who actually is coming up and they should be, you know, the timing should work for them to kind of make their contention. It's all put on the back burner. That's what I don't like about it. It just holds up everything for a television show that, you know, a lot of people don't even really, you know, in his 20th season aren't going to care about that much.
This was an important one because they're fighting for the belt, and that's a big deal. And you have, you know, arguably right now 11 of the best strawweights signed. They're going to add 5 more. This was one that I actually thought didn't need coaches. Every woman for herself. They're all fighting for that belt. Switch it up a little bit, but you know, that's the direction they're going in. It also got me thinking a little bit about fighters being a lot more vocal these days. Now you have some that are out of the UFC, like Nate Quarry talking about pain and whatnot, but you do have the John Joneses of the world who's been talking about not getting pushed and what happened with Gilbert, what's happening with Nate Diaz. Do you feel like fighters are starting to find their voice, maybe getting a little more, you know, confident in speaking up against the UFC? It feels like something's going on here.
I do, and not just them, fans. You know, fans are speaking up against the UFC too, and I wonder. I'm trying to figure out what the turning point was, or if there even was a turning point. But if I'm just being sort of honest and reading the tea leaves, I feel like the GSP thing kind of turned people a little bit. Not you know, into angry monsters against the UFC, but certainly made them a little less sympathetic to things. I mean, it's one thing to say, well, listen, Tito Ortiz is a big-headed malcontent. Who cares what he has to say? And a lot of fans love the old ribs, the jokes on Tito Ortiz, but they don't really like him on George St. Pierre. He's kind of immune to that sort of thing, and especially when it involves with what was perceived to be, you know, I'm trying to ethically raise the bar here with drug testing. It wasn't like he was saying, I don't get paid, or I wanted to fight in Toronto. No, I'd like to have more rigorous drug testing. And he kind of, you know, however you want to perceive it, I thought he got thrown under the bus a little bit. Since then, everyone's kind of been a little more sensitive to him, to Dana White criticizing Jose Aldo, to criticizing Alistair Overeem. Even if he has a point, the people are like, why are you attacking your own guys? And I feel like fighters speaking up is part of maybe a little bit of a climate that's been generating where I'm sure some of these feelings have been there all along. I don't think things have gotten bad that makes them speak up all out of a sudden. I just think they feel more free because if they see the fans pushing back, they're not the only ones who are vocalizing their discontent.
Yeah, I think it actually started with that as well with GSP, although maybe even a little earlier, even when John Jones got criticized for the cancellation of UFC 151. And when that happened, Jones was looking out for his best interest. And that's what these guys should be doing. They're independent contractors. They're not employees looking out for the good of the company. And I think that a lot of people are starting to recognize this. It's not so much that we have to demonize the UFC here. The UFC has been, they do their business for their bottom line. And the fighters individually try to do the best they can, but they don't have a collective. And I know that now there's starting to be a little groundswell about, the idea of a union is starting to come up. Which I'm sure really rankles the UFC, particularly with the Fertittas being, they own the Station Casino, which is the biggest non-union casinos in Nevada. So, which means that they obviously have a lot of experience in sort of keeping a union out of the works. So I'm sure they'll do their best to keep a union out of the works of the UFC. But the more that conversation comes up, the more that some fighters, start maybe thinking not so much about only themselves, but the group as a whole. It's better for everybody. You know what? It works all through sports. Everybody says you can't have you want every man for himself. Well, you go to the the NFL, and the best players in the NFL. You got your Peyton Manning, your Tom Brady. They're in the union, just like the guy that's a special teams player for the worst team in the league. They're all in a union together. And if fighters were to come up with some kind of collective way, not to screw the UFC, but just to work it out so that they all get what they're entitled to, it'll change the dynamic. I don't see it happening purely because I think the Fertittas are so good at keeping it out of their business.
In terms of the revolt stuff that we were talking about, I mean, it's some of it is just repetition. It's like people in experience for so long. We've seen Dana White, how he's going to act. You can almost predict a lot of times how he's going to react on something. He still catches us off guard quite a bit. But the UFC's handling of certain things, since this has become more mainstream, more media outlets, the media has now followed the sport longer. The media has now written about the sport longer. The media has now been in the scrums longer. They know the situations more. And so the negativity is sort of pervasive all through it. It's not just, it's sort of the negative backlash, I should say, for some of the stuff, not just the fighters, but the media is starting to pick up on it. They exacerbate it. They maybe push it further than they would have before. It's all part of the growth of the sport in its own way. But as far as the fighters themselves, it is interesting. There is a tension there. I agree with both you guys. I mean, honestly, like when you go back to 151 and the whole John Jones thing, I remember the backlash then, but it seems like it's sort of been building steadily into this tension between fighters, and you'll hear mumblings and stuff all the time covering the sport. But to me, the GSP one really is like the thing that happened where people couldn't understand it. They couldn't understand the criticism that was being placed at GSP for the reason he was doing it, which is basically rooted in integrity of the sport. I think that his story, people want to believe him as much as they would normally with the UFC. They're not just going to take the UFC's version on this, and I think a lot of fighters in general are seeing that, they're hearing it, they see it in the media and everything else, and I think that they just to that point, where you got to push back a little bit. I feel like that's where they're at.
Listen, if you look at the UFC 171 card, right, it's really good. There's not a Bellator card this year that's as good as 171. Flat. Like, there's not one. I mean, we'll see how the fights end up, but on paper, they're not even in the same ballpark. But I think by the UFC's own standards so far, we're still very early into the year, 2 months, almost 3. But the product has not been strong this year. It's been okay. And I think some fans love Fight Pass. I think Fight Pass is going to be, in the end, ultimately it will be an interesting service. But I think some fans bristle at the idea of having to pay yet more money. And I think when your product is by their own standards, again, not relative to Bellator or anybody else who's not even in the conversation, but by their own UFC standards, particularly after a strong 2013, I think some fans, like if there's all these other factors going on where the GSP thing turns you, and your product is not particularly strong, in the last show, the UFC 170 was not a particularly strong show, fans are going to be much less sympathetic. If you have bad customer service, but you're selling amazing products, it's like the soup Nazi. The soup Nazi is a jerk, but my God, the soup. Well, what if the soup's bad? All of a sudden, your soup's bad and you got a soup Nazi. So that's sort of where we're at. I'm not saying the product is bad, but I'm saying relative to how high the standard was in 2013, it's sunk a little bit so far because of injuries, yes, but also because these cards are really getting thin.
And we'll get to Fight Pass in a minute, but Jeff, you brought up the union talk, and that makes me think about this talk of a uniform coming to the UFC. Now, I don't know if that's the right word, honestly, but there is something brewing as far as a sponsorship deal that will knock off some of the existing sponsorship deals that guys can get and have the fighters all, have this big pot and they'll share it and they'll have to wear certain brands, whatnot. If there was a union would have to okay something like this. It wouldn't just be the UFC saying, all right, this is the situation. Do you think the uniform, the sponsorship deal, whatever you want to call it, might be the thing that gets the fighters to really start, coming together and saying, wait a second, we don't want this deal. We get X amount, that we don't want to share that.
Well, I think that it contributes. Every time that the pie gets cut a different way, each fighter realizes what he or she is getting out of it. And again, it's not a matter of demonizing the UFC or how it does business. It's just a matter of how is the power shared in this sport. Right now, the UFC is the big entity that has all the power, and each individual fighter, has to fight for him or herself. Yet, if they all were together, there would be a little bit, a little more of an even playing field, let's say. And the uniforms would be a great thing. Now, I think, the uniforms, it all depends. Are they going to go with the Speedo look, or they're going to go with...
That's what I don't think it's fair to call it a uniform, honestly.
I mean, I think it's...
I don't think they're going to all have to wear the exact same thing, and not be allowed to wear, certain things. But there is going to be a certain brand and a certain line of clothing that's, from what we understand, that you will have to wear.
Yeah, or some uniformity that is part of the equation.
When I think of uniform, I think of what they wear on Tough. I don't think it's going to be like that.
Yeah, I wonder whether, was it Cody McKenzie, the guy that forgot his shorts?
Sure.
I mean, I'm wondering whether there's something like that where they said, we need to do something where this is not...
It was in the works before that.
Yeah. Okay.
But yes, that would certainly eliminate a situation
they need to have
like
something
that.
where... But I think that it all comes down to what are these guys going to get out of this? And are they going to be... Is this going to be one more thing that comes out of their pie, their part of the pie, and goes back to the UFC's coffers, or is it going to be something where they're going to make some money? I mean, that's really the bottom line, isn't it?
That's not the UFC's problem, is it? So
No,
I'm just getting upset this guy up. No. What I wonder, I mean, like we said, we don't really know 100%. We just know it's an apparel brand probably, and we don't know to what extent these uniforms. But when you talk to fighters, you ask them why they're fighters to begin with, it's almost like that they couldn't play teams. They didn't want to play team sports. The individuality of what they do is the only thing that really got them into this sport to begin with. Any kind of homogenization in that way almost freaks them out. Like, I feel like some of the backlash comes from stuff like that. Like, they just don't want to be under thumb quite that much. Regardless of, some people may gain from it, there's been a lot of talk about the people who are open up the prelims. Maybe they gain something from this. Maybe the other guys lose something from this, etc. I think, honestly, in some weird way, that the autonomy factor really plays in, that these guys just can't do, you always hear complaints about the walkout music being monitored, everything else like that, little things like that. I just feel like it's just one more little thing that gets into their craw a little bit.
My sense is, I think Jeff makes the right point about the demonization of the UFC. Like, let's just play a game for a moment, right? You say the UFC has absolutely the fighter's best interest at heart, and they're legitimately trying to solve a problem, right? Let's take those things for granted. Do I think that they'll come up with the same product that they would if there was a union and someone bargaining on their behalf? I do not. It is impossible for me to be in your best interest if we have competing interests. Even if I have a charitable heart and I'm trying to do the right thing and I am thinking about what you want, I can't possibly do that. If you have a divorce, I come from divorced parents. Can you imagine one parent deciding what and even trying to do it amicably? Well, it's okay for you to have those things. You're going to win out here. They would say, "Are you crazy? Like, I want so much more." And until they have their interests represented collectively, and somebody who knows how to negotiate and knows how to bargain and understands what the market can bear, as good-natured as the UFC might be, and I believe that they are, as much as they're trying to solve a problem, which they might end up solving. I'm not saying the solution will be horrible, but it's not going to be the same as it were if there was somebody on their behalf bargaining for them collectively. Fact.
Nate Diaz, union president.
You know, guys, another interesting story that we've been talking about for so long, and Jeff brought it up in our year-end show, was TRT. You really...
I was thinking about that the other day. You nailed it.
And I was mocked by everybody.
You were mocked.
I was like, oh, Jeff.
And
funny
here
guy.
it is. Not only has it not disappeared, it's getting bigger and bigger.
Yes.
Yeah,
So I want to know, Jeff, from you, and we just saw this great ESPN.com article about it. It seems like the mainstream is finally starting to realize that something's up here. This time next year, is TRT gone in MMA?
I think it will be. I don't know, but I'm if I had to guess one way or the other definitively, I would say yes. And I think that the key word there is mainstream. You know, I work for Sports Illustrated and ESPN as well. These are a couple of the really, the big mainstream sports entities. And when something like ESPN comes out with this, not just in their MMA coverage, but on the outside the lines, which is something that reaches everybody that follows sports, and they don't just talk about TRT as it relates to this sport, but they talk about it in relation to all sports. This is a big deal. This means that we're getting it in a much better context, and we're starting to understand that it's not just a problem that exists in sports, it's a problem that's existing in this specific sport. It's really something that MMA has to deal with, and that the UFC, they in the ESPN story, they sort of alluded to the UFC's role in this, but we're always hearing Dana White talk about how we're regulated by the government, and that's true. But the UFC competes in all different jurisdictions, yet the rules of the fights are basically the same. So you're not going to have a fight in Vegas where you can elbow a guy, where you can kick a guy in the head while he's down, and in Atlantic City where you can't. These rules are consistent. So it can be something that the UFC can do it. They don't have to sit there and say, well, just because the Nevada Commission okays testosterone exemptions, we have to fall in line with it. They can make their own rules if they choose to. They've made the rules, or they follow a set of rules that relate to how the sport is contested. And I think that they're going to start understanding that this is not in their best interest. This is, people are going to question the integrity of the sport the more that this happens. And I think that having this big fight coming up with Weidman and Belfort, and having it in Las Vegas, this is only going to get bigger.
The kind of scrutiny that it's getting, especially from that piece in ESPN, is exactly probably what's needed. It's one thing for the MMA media on MMA sites or just MMA-centric people to constantly harp on it, but it's another thing for Mike Fish, an investigative reporter, to then come in and do a thorough... And they were working on it back months and months and months ago when I was still at ESPN, so I knew that this thing was in the hop for a long time. It wasn't like they just come up with this idea. This was something they had really been looking into for a long time. But it takes a piece like this to sort of stack up MMA, where it's at, versus the other sports, and to show you just how absurd it really is. Even though they weren't very specific in terms of the NFL, like a handful doesn't really give you a firm grasp of how many people in the NFL are maybe doing TRT, things like that. But it just shows you, it magnifies the loophole. It shows you that there is a loophole in play, that probably there's not a real medical reason for these things to go on unless, a guy started losing his testosterone, levels through steroid, use earlier in his career and things like that. So it really magnifies those things and put it into basic language for people to understand. I think that was important, and I think it only magnifies itself, particularly with this big fight coming up with Chris Weidman, his first defense against Vitor Belfort, who in 2006 did pop hot for it in that state, and then has since been on TRT. So I think will it go away or by next year? I don't know, but it seems like there's a point when it seems obvious it has to, and I think that's what this helps get there.
It also magnifies that TRT is a PED. I mean, and that we sometimes don't relate those two things together, but it is something that enhances one's performance. And so, how can we separate this out and say, well, you can't take all these different anabolic steroids, but it's okay to do this? I think that this report. We already knew this. A lot of people who follow MMA closely knew all the different elements of this report, but this report put it all in one place for not just those of us who follow the sport, but people who are sports fans or just general public out there. It's become very obvious. This is a performance-enhancing drug, and if you want to do business with that, then be our guest, but your sport is gonna suffer the consequences.
I thought it was alarming that no boxer, according to the report,
just
not
gonna say.
one boxer had even applied. That is
In Nevada.
Nevada, right?
Yeah, that was the most fascinating note.
Unbelievable. You know what the thing about that story is? It really got me. There's no, I mean, unless you're just an absolute idiot, there's no way to read that story and come away with any other conclusion than TRT is a scam. What a scam! Unbelievable. If you are on TRT, except in the most, I mean the most extreme circumstance, you are scamming the system. And if you have a hand in it, you are a scam artist selling snake oil. That is, well, not snake oil because it works, but that's the ethical position that you occupy. And one note that I think was important, the guy who wrote the article, Mike Fish has been nominated for 2 Pulitzer Prizes. Now, he didn't win either, but certainly the kind of work you have to do, especially as a sports reporter, to get a Pulitzer Prize nomination is, I'll never even sniff anything like that in my whole career. And Mike Fish doesn't care about being on UFC conference calls. He doesn't need to interview anybody tomorrow. He has no skin in the game except for the facts. And so that frees him to really do the kind of digging that I think some other people and institutions just simply aren't capable of doing. And so it's important that when the non-MMA media get involved and they bring their big guns, it really sort of makes reporting generally much better.
2 things that I don't understand. I don't understand why the UFC doesn't just ban it. And then I guess I kind of understand.
They might.
But, I know they don't like to go against the commission, so if they say if Nevada's okay with it, we need to follow Nevada. But when they go to Brazil, Brazil now has their own quote-unquote commission, but when they go to England, why not just not allow it there? And the other thing I don't understand is, if you're Chris Weidman, why don't you just say, I don't want to fight this guy. I don't want to fight you if you're on TRT. I think it's cheating. Why can't you just say that? Why can't you just take a stand as a fighter? Would you get in trouble? Would the UFC cut you? If fighters start saying, I don't want to fight a guy who's on TRT who's going to be punching and kicking me in the head, what can you say to that?
Because they do it as a source of pride. Right,
I'm going to be the guy.
Yeah, you're on TRT, and I still whipped your ass.
Well,
that's what they like.
He did it. How'd that work
exactly
out?
that.
Right,
I know it didn't work out for him, but that was his attitude. Is like, hey, he can do whatever he wants. I'm still going to go beat him. It was like that's what fueled him, is to go beat him no matter what he was on.
One of the takeaways I have from the story was zeroing in on the culpability here, and there was a quote that actually was pulled out in bold. It was from Vitor, saying something like, I'm the guy that's considered the bad guy here, and it's true. He is. He's the guy that everybody talks about, and to a certain extent, I'm not going to blame Vitor Belfort or Chael Sonnen or the other guys who are on TRT. They are following the rules. The rules have been set out there. It's almost like if when some back when guys could do soccer kicks, those were the rules. So they did that. So to some extent, these are the rules that are laid out. So the culpability for me is in the athletic commission's lap, the UFC's lap. Not so much the fighters. The fighters are following the rules. You're right though. It is a total scam, but it's not like he's not really using a loophole. I know that they even mentioned the story.
They sort of are. I disagree a little bit. They're going to doctors of whose grip on the Hippocratic Oath is tenuous, okay? And they're saying, I need to go to the commission. Can you convince them my testicles don't work? And their testicles, I don't know this to be true to a fact, I'm assuming they work just fine. They're going there, hat in hand, and claiming some medical illness they don't actually have, that is not supported by medical science. That's lying. That's lying.
But I think the commission has the responsibility to not just take the word of anybody that comes walking in the door. I think you're right. If somebody's walking in there and they're lying about it, but I think that it seems like they have created this exemption with a wide enough doorway that guys can just get in there if they have any kind of I was sort of low energy or this or that. And
take a nap.
Lethargic.
Eat a fruit cup.
Yeah, you're a new parent. You probably could get an exemption right now.
That'd be great. Knock people's heads off. Yeah. I think at the end of the day, we're going to look back at this era in MMA as baseball fans look back at the late '90s with McGuire and Sosa, when everyone was saying they're not breaking the rules, but they kind of.
Well, even Dana White, obviously, he's been wishy-washy on the whole thing. You see him now, almost. I feel like fairly firmly turning into he wants it gone. I think that's the first big thing, is you get guys like him, obviously Dana White being who he is, not wanting it in the sport anymore. And he's starting to say that it's ruining fighters' careers, that sort of thing. I feel like
that's what they say about people on steroids. Like he's equating the two.
Yes.
Like if you're on so much juice, you cannot compete without it. He's raising the bar in terms of the consequences.
And why not? I mean, it is what it is. It is a substance that, they say, well, they don't compete on it, but they train on it. And if you have 50% more energy in the gym for week after week after week, you learn how to do those. You learn how to drill those head kicks that knock out Bisping and knock out Rockhold, because you've been drilling endlessly, and you didn't get tired after doing it for a half hour like you would as a 36-year-old man. You can do it for 2.5 hours because you've got a lot of energy.
That Michael Bisping, in that same piece we're talking about, basically stood up and said, you know what, I've lost these guys, but when guys get older, they have experience in the cage. Most of the times in the fight games, these guys have experience. That should sort of make up for some of the deficiencies they're suffering that anybody who gets older goes through. That's something that goes into the merit of the sport as well. That you look at it like guys get older, there's a natural order to things. Young guys are supposed to come and be able to overtake these older guys, and that's how it progresses. At some point in a guy's career, it's strange that we've found this way of sort of making a plateau for these guys who to keep coming back up there. It also plays with, I don't know. There's just so many strange aspects to it. But I thought Michael Bisping really kind of nailed that a little bit too. That your experience in there at some point should trump some of your physical things that are going on with it.
Yeah, if you're going to allow somebody to inject something that's going to give a 36-year-old the energy of a 22-year-old, well, then you should be able to inject a 22-year-old with something that gives them the experience of a 36-year-old. But they're not doing that.
Final word?
Yeah, just the point that he was making was not just that, the training benefits. These guys go out there, if I'm not on TRT, I can't live. I need TRT. You liars. You're all liars. All the ones, I'm not sure who all has trotted out that line, but that's my point. Is when they go and they say things like, I need TRT to live, I'd love to test that theory out, boy.
Guys, last Saturday, Ronda Rousey won in controversial fashion. She continues, obviously, her undefeated streak in MMA. Dana White now calling her the biggest star in the sport, arguably the biggest star in the history of the sport. Well. We're not going to talk about that today because we've already talked about her stardom. But what I want to know is this Cyborg fight, which seems to now be really gaining some momentum with her saying that she wants to move down to 135, with her parting ways with Tito Ortiz. Do you think it's going to happen? And not only that, does the UFC need for it to happen? Could this be the biggest fight of 2014?
Need might be a strong word. I certainly would think it's in their best interest, and I think they know it's in their best interest too. I mean, I think Dana White does raise some pretty reasonable objections. First of all, she did say, to his credit, he's right when he says, if you say something like you're going to die at the weight class, then I'm going to be a little bit reserved about trying to rush it along.
The commission probably won't license her, right?
Well, I mean, I think if she makes it safely and she has what she says she's going to have with medical documentation and supervision, let's see. I think he's right to say, let's see what Invicta can do with you at 135. Okay. However, let's say she does look good enough and healthy enough to compete. We'll make that a given. It'd be kind of crazy not to make that fight. And the reason why is not just that they have a rivalry or something like that, and it's a clash of, I know people don't know who Cyborg is, but she's ready to be a star in this particular circumstance. She's ready to be a foil. It's that the fight is intriguing, right? Forget all the star power and the salesmanship. No one really knows what would happen. I mean, she goes in there and just bodies Sarah McMahon like it was nothing, Maybe the fight was stopped early, but I mean, I thought the writing was on the wall. But the point being is, with Cyborg, she could just crush her standing, and Rousey does take punches to the face to close the distance. By contrast, I could see Rousey hits arm bars from the guard, from in transition, from top, bottom side. She hits them at all angles, so I could see her subbing her out. So it's not just that she has this ability to make a big fight. Maybe she could beat Ronda, and that to me is the only interesting twist in that whole division. I don't think Alexis Davis really is that girl.
You know what's also interesting about it is I see a lot of people saying, okay, let's just say she makes 135 in Invicta. She's not going to, get a title shot right off the bat. She doesn't deserve. She needs to win in the UFC. Come on. I mean, Ronda Rousey got a title shot essentially, a few fights in. This is a big fight. She's fought on CBS. People know who Cyborg is. If you know MMA, even casually, I think you know who Cyborg is because of the look, because of the name, because of what she's done to the likes of Gina Carano. She needs to get a title shot right away. If she signs with the UFC and doesn't fight for the belt right away, that, dare I say, is
promotional malpractice.
There you go, right? Would you agree?
Absolutely. Well, if she can make 135 safely and she takes whatever drug testing needs to happen because she did fail, a steroid test. And she passes those two things, and the UFC does not make this fight. They might as well take the championship belt and melt it down into belly button rings because it is useless. It is worthless. This is the only fight that somebody could say what Luke just said, where you don't know what's going to happen. I don't care. I think Kat Zingano absolutely earned a shot at Ronda Rousey, and she should get that next shot. But I don't have a lot of hope that it's going to be a competitive fight. Alexis Davis, I don't have much hope. But Cyborg, if they have to make that fight. Absolutely, 100% have to make it if she can, fulfill her end of the deal.
I agree 100%. I mean, when you look at, that's the problem, is right now you look at the two names, Alexis Davis and Kat Zingano, you just can't imagine. I mean, Kat Zingano has a little bit of intrigue, I'd say a little bit more so, having beat Miesha Tate. But before then, she'd only really, she had one Invicta fight against Raquel Pennington. She hasn't really had a bunch of names on it. It's not like she's primed and ready. This is somebody, we're talking about Cyborg, who for a long time was the 145 champion in Strikeforce and now Invicta. I mean, it's a no-brainer when there's only two names out there that really look like they can compete. When there's only one competition for each person, and that happens to be the other person, it's the only fight people are going to talk about until it happens. And I've heard a lot about people saying, why would she just get a title shot coming into the UFC? And it's for that very reason. I mean, she was the reigning 145 champion, making her way down to do this. They've talked about it forever. Ronda Rousey's been back and forth with her. It's an obvious fight. If it weren't made, like you mentioned the promotion about, it would mean that it would almost be a glaring thing that the UFC were almost protecting its star at that point. And I think that would be more glaring than just putting it together. And honestly, from a competitive standpoint, to me, that seems like a coin flip. To me, that's the best thing you could do with people who have not been able, people who are that dominant in their weight divisions.
The other big story from Saturday night, Daniel Cormier looking very good at 205. Of course, he didn't fight a top contender, and I don't understand why people are saying, oh, he's still a few wins away from fighting for the belt. I think I would have no problem with Daniel Cormier fighting for the title tomorrow. I would have had no problem with Daniel Cormier fighting for the belt in his 205 debut. The only catch, of course, was, will he make the weight? Now we know he can make the weight. But it's like, I don't understand this thing. Well, he hasn't beaten anyone at 205. Does everything that he did at heavyweight not count? Is that how this works? It doesn't make any sense to me.
Yes and no.
It doesn't. Why?
Well,
why should it be no?
I think, I'm with you that I think he is clearly a guy who should be tested against the top of the division. If not a title shot, then, the one right before that, right? I mean,
right.
Title eliminator. I'm okay with that. But if we're being technical, that's not how you rank people. You rank them on their accomplishments. He had no light heavyweight resume before last Saturday, and he beat a guy unranked.
But this is a guy who was going to get a heavyweight title shot and moved down to not fight a friend. I mean, if he was worthy of being a heavyweight contender, why can't he go down?
I'm saying rationally, I'm with you, given the fight, but from a ranking standpoint, it's crazy. People are like, oh, he's top two. How can you? He beat Patrick Cummins. You don't know if he's top two in the division. I personally believe that. Sorry, I don't hit my mic. I don't know.
Would you have a problem with him getting a title shot right away?
No, I'd be fine with that. But I'm not going to go out and say, oh, he's number two in the division. Technically speaking, he doesn't really deserve to be ranked that high.
I will tell you one person who told me that he has more work to do before he gets the title shot, and his name was Daniel Cormier.
Really?
When I talked to him last week before this fight, I said,
maybe he was being humble.
I brought this up and I said, look, if you had beaten Rashad Evans, no question, you're the title. And I didn't even get the whole question out. I was trying to be nice about the way I phrased the question so as not to insult him. In the middle of it, he just said, nope, there's more work to do. More work to do, absolutely. And then I said, well, you sit on the Fox set sometimes with this guy named Chael Sonnen who went up to a light heavyweight and coming off a loss had got a light heavyweight championship shot, and he said, well, yeah, you're right. Sometimes injuries happen, and so I'm not going to discount the possibility. So if circumstances conspire to put him in a title fight, I'm not going to cry about it. But I don't think that he has necessarily. I think he needs to beat somebody credible at 205.
I call shenanigans on this. I spoke to him just yesterday, and he told me number one contender fight, or if Gustafsson loses, he wants a title
I saw
shot.
that, but
he
last
was
week
being humble. He was just being humble.
How do you know?
before the
Maybe
fight.
he was being
afraid
bold.
of Patrick Cummins.
He contains multitudes.
I talked to him pre Popeye's
Right.
chicken.
Exactly.
You talked
now
to
he
him post.
has all that.
My thing is, it's really the complexity of the title picture in that division to me. I mean, you still got Gustafsson, who has his fight with Jimmy Manuwa. To me, he still has the inside track so long as Jones takes care of Teixeira in April. To me, that's still the pecking order.
Sure.
I feel like Gustafsson is still the guy, given that first fight, that makes the most sense to do back. Now, like you said, if circumstances change, if something kind of goes off the railings, I'd have no problem with Cormier stepping in there because he's right there. It doesn't matter to me that Patrick Cummins or Rashad Evans, to be completely honest. I believe he would have been sort of in that same position either way. If he'd beaten Rashad Evans, it would have been, might have been more people talking about him being ready for that title shot. But to me, he still doesn't leapfrog Gustafsson in that race. Mm-hmm. That's the fight, the rematch that was already there. You almost beat John Jones, it was a great fight. To me, that's still the one that has to go first. But if it doesn't happen, then I guess what I'm saying is I would have no problem with them if the circumstances were right, putting Cormier in there next.
It's also a lot about perception too. I mean, I understand where you're coming from when you say that rankings have to do with what you've done. I sort of look at it a little differently. I think of what you're talking about. I look at that more as standings because that you win and you're one game up in the standings. I think that there are times when rankings to me are an opinion, and so I look at them a little differently. But notwithstanding that, I think that all these fights, it's about perception. I mean, even look at the title fight. Teixeira has won, was it 20, 21, 22?
20-something.
20-something in a row.
20 odd.
But nobody in the top 10, at least not when he was fighting the guy. He's beaten some guys who at one point in their career were in the top 10, but he's not beaten a top 10 fighter. He's beaten guys that I guess would be higher in the pecking order than Pat Cummins, but not really a top 10 guy. So was he deserving of this? I don't know. He reeled off 20-something wins in a row. Maybe that's worth something. But if you're not beating a top 10 guys, is it worth something? So I think that a lot of it has to do with perception. Cormier comes down. He's beaten Josh Barnett. He's beaten Frank Mir. He's beaten who else? He's beaten
Roy Nelson.
Roy Nelson. He's beaten some big heavyweights.
Silva knocked him out.
Bigfoot Silva. So it's all about, do you think that he's a guy that will be competitive? That's how the UFC seems to match. And sometimes I find fault with that because you could look at that same thing and give credibility to Nick Diaz's claim that he wants a title shot because he's already beaten Robbie Lawler. So I mean, you can look at things when you deal just with perception as opposed to actual wins, then the whole thing gets skewed. And I prefer the meritocracy angle, but I don't think that's the way the UFC
From an
deals
entertainment
it.
standpoint, too, there is bad blood that exists between John Jones and Daniel Cormier, and I know that would be a nice selling point for him to get back in there as well.
Okay, guys, final question of the day. It's a very busy weekend in the world of mixed martial arts that we're about to embark on. We've got Bellator returning with an interesting card, Rampage Jackson, King Mo fighting in separate brackets of their light heavyweight tournament. We've got the new Titan FC making its debut on CBS Sports Network. How about the World Series of Fighting Canada card that happened last weekend? I won't spoil it for you. That's airing on NBC Sports Network on Friday. And then early Saturday morning, I like to call this the prime time hour for new fathers at around 6 a.m. or so. It's the UFC in China. In Macau, they've got John Hathaway versus Dong Young Kim, and of course the highly anticipated finals of the Tough China tournament. I want to know, we'll go down the line, what are you most looking forward to? Is there a fight? Is there a story? Because let's not forget, beginning March 1st, which is Saturday, Fight Pass now has a paywall. Right? Now you have to pay $9.95 to not only watch John Hathaway fight Dong Young Kim, but to watch the prelims, an upcoming pay-per-view and whatnot. What's the story you're most looking forward to seeing play out?
Our cup runneth over. I am going to go with, there's some decent fights on all the cards, I should say. I am most looking forward to Lawal versus Zayats. I think that this is really make or break for Mo Lawal. He took a pay cut, as I understand it, when he re-signed with Bellator most recently. Who knows what's going to happen with his TNA thing? The losses to Newton weren't great. As our colleague Sean Al-Shadi did an interview with him, I believe it, that those staph infection surgeries took a lot out of him. That he came back at all was kind of miraculous. And the reality is, if you don't watch a lot of Bellator, you don't realize this, Mikhail Zayats is a bad dude. In fact, I favor him to win that fight, and because he barely lost to Newton, and he was badly injured, which folks don't realize either, heading into that Newton fight. So for me, if Lawal's going to make something happen in his career, it is basically do or die for him on Friday. And I hope he can pull it out, but boy, is the deck stacked against him.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually going to go to the Bellator card. I haven't been to one of those live. I've so I'm interested in seeing the sort of the whole pageantry of the event, how they pull it off.
That's a strong word, pageantry, for a Bellator show.
Okay, whatever. And also the two big fights in there to see whether clearly they would like to be able to schedule a King Mo versus Rampage fight down the road. I'd like to see if that gets pulled off. And I looked at their whole season coming up, and I didn't realize that it was like the beginning of November when Alvarez and Chandler had their rematch. So that's like 4 months, and we still don't have a scheduled third. I know they talk about having, or even one of those guys fighting somebody else, and so they've scheduled out a season at least partially, and I want to. There's nothing that I want to get. I want to get excited about one, and so I'm not sure that I would get I'm going to go dancing around because of the possibility of Rampage versus Lawal, but I at least want to see whether they can make that thing happen.
I know Bjorn Rebney had told me last I spoke to him that they were going to reveal the Chandler, the trilogy fight tomorrow night, or tonight as the Bellator. So we'll see. Maybe that's what you're looking at.
That's the pageantry, okay, right there. That's it.
What do you think of that?
It's funny. Exact same reason. I go with that exact same fight for that exact same reason. To me, that this is a very tough fight for King Mo, and he's at an age and at a time now where it's all the potential that we talked about for him coming up with his wrestling pedigree. Back with Team Quest, back in those days when he was coming up, we really thought he was going to be a world beater. And to sort of have petered out where he's at in his career, I feel like this really is that moment for him. He has to. It's either go time or it's no more Mo time. I mean, he's just going to go away. He won't go away 100%, but I don't think he'll ever kind of enter that echelon we had him pegged for. And I agree with Luke 100% and with Zayats. Just having watched him fight a couple times, I feel like I almost feel like Mo is the underdog in this one. So if he's able to kind of turn it around against this guy, it'd be a big deal. And the other thing is, Bellator has tried these things before where they've set up their brackets and we're supposedly, we're working towards some eventuality involving King Mo himself, and we never get there. So it'd be interesting if they finally get their wish where we get we get King Mo against Quentin Rampage Jackson.
Real quickly, just to the point he's making, everyone says like, oh my God, they made these 4-man tournaments, and of course the 4-man tournaments are a bit of a, they're skirting the issue here a little bit. They're kind of cutting corners, but the reality is, man, I don't think either of those fights, the Rampage and Pumbu fight or Zayas Lawal, are at all gimmies. You look at the odds, Rampage and Lawal are like heavy favorites. Man, that's totally out of whack. That's interesting because, yeah, it's a 4-man tournament. Okay, they kind of got an easy way in, but dude, those are not for those guys and where they are in their career and their current abilities and just how underdogs murder people in Bellator. That's a really, really, really interesting tournament to watch.
A very interesting way to start their new season on Spike TV. I'm just curious to see how the whole Fight Pass thing plays out. How many people have kept their subscriptions? How many people will pay to watch? Not so much about this one card in Macau, but just how it all kind of comes together now that people have to pay for this, to watch the early prelims of a pay-per-view, to watch a Gustafsson Manoa fight that happens next week in London. And I'm kind of curious, maybe a little biased. I think this is kind of do or die for Matt Mitrione. I know he's not a big name, but he's all the way in Macau. Matt Mitrione being shipped over to Macau to fight Sean Jordan. Now, one time I did have very high hopes for him, and I think he needs a win on Saturday morning in Macau to maybe stick around in the UFC. So some of the things that I'm looking forward to, and it's a very busy weekend. And let us know in the comment section below what you think about this upcoming weekend in the world of mixed martial arts, or anything we talked about on this supersized edition of the MMA Beat. We tried to give you a little more because we've been off for the last couple of weeks. Hope you'd enjoyed it. For Luke, Jeff, Chuck, I'm Ariel. Thank you so much for watching another episode of the MMA Beat right here on MMAfighting.com.